Hello, welcome. Greetings from Vienna, where I am speaking from. My name is Sarah Davies. I am a scholar of science communication at the University of Vienna. We are currently enjoying a huge thunderstorm, much needed thunderstorm. I hope it is not disruptive at all. Welcome to this parallel session on curiosity, wonder, and awe in science engagement. It's my pleasure and honor to chair a discussion which picks up on the themes of the plenary yesterday. An incredibly rich hour. I guess everyone here will agree with that. So it's really wonderful to have a little bit more time to go into some of the discussions and questions and issues in more detail, to give also our three wonderful panelists who are joining us today time to kind of converse with each other a little bit more. The panelists, of course, I think really need no introduction, but I will briefly introduce them again. We have with us Tania Lombrozo from Princeton University, Jeanne Garbarino, who is the director of the RockEDU Science Outreach, and Daniel Silva from the University of Ontago. As I said, this will be a discussion, a very informal discussion. I encourage you, if you have questions from the plenary, please put them in the Q&A and I will feed them on. If you have relevant experiences or reflections on the role and place and value of these emotions of curiosity or awe or wonder in science engagement, if you have your own kind of thoughts and reflections you want to bring, please put those also into the Q&A. And again, I can put those into the discussion. Without further ado, I think I will ask the panelists to continue the reflections that they started yesterday. Tania, you started with this really, for me, helpful and kind of rich discussion of the nature of curiosity. It was very nice for me to get an understanding of how this emotion has been defined and looked at in research. I thought we'd start then with a question about your own curiosities. So if you think about this topic as an area of research and practice in science engagement, what are the one or two, maximum two, things that you are most curious about? What are the things that you would really like to know more, that have whetted your appetite or have kind of snagged you, made you curious within this area? Daniel, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. So I'm really interested in moving away from awe, actually, from awe and wonder. I'm interested in the role of emotions more broadly in the communication science. I'm really curious about the fear of science, people who fear science, who are scared of it. This is something that I'm working on a proposal right now on, and I'm interested to see the different ways in which people are afraid of science, why they're afraid of it, where does this come from, what cultural experience have they had that leads them to that. So yeah, I'm curious about the role of fear, of anger, of other so-called negative emotions about science. Where is this coming from? Because I think this is a topic that many of you might be interested in, considering some of the discussions we've had around COVID. So yeah, it's a topic for me.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting, I think, as well. I mean, often in these conversations, we want to be inspiring, we want to talk about these positive emotions. But I think also when we think about the conference as a whole, of course, negative emotions are playing a role in science engagement as well, and in the way in which we talk about science engagement. Tania, what are your curiosities?
So many, but I'll be good and just share one. So one of the things that we found in my research and that I mentioned yesterday is that one of the biggest predictors of people's curiosity is their expectation that they're going to learn something new and valuable. And I am fascinated and somewhat baffled by how we generate those expectations and when they're accurate and when they're inaccurate, right? In order to be curious, to recognize there's something you don't know, you have to know what you don't know to some extent, right? So how do we get that those initial senses that there's something to be learned, that there's something that we don't yet know that's worth knowing, that gets the process going?
Yeah, also super interesting. And I think very much relates to one or two things, Daniel, you talked about in terms of the learning of these emotions, and also this notion perhaps of the virtuous circle, Tania. that we become more curious as we kind of start to see the landscape that our curiosity takes place in, if that makes sense. Jeanne, how about you?
Sure. So as many of you already know from yesterday, I come from a basic science background, and I work in a basic science institution. And my role there has been to do outreach and engagement with science. And I work with a lot of scientists, and science itself has been historically exclusive. And I wonder, because we are trying to promote through one of our mission pieces for RockEDU is promoting science as a human endeavor. And one of the things I feel really curious about is, and this relates to what Daniel had been saying, is if we can talk more about the role of emotions in how science is conducted, can we generate more inclusive scientific environments? And we're starting with wonder as one of our first emotions, but I am very curious to think about how to incorporate these emotions or scientific emotions into the conversations as we move forward in our work to promote a more just space.
Yeah, thank you. This also, well, this raises for me at least a couple of interesting directions to go in, but I will take my cue from the chat because Keegan also has a comment about this, about wanting to know more about the emotion science interface. And this, I think, relates to the way in which we often see emotions in scientific practice as separate. Tania, you started your presentation exactly with this point. But in reality, or in, I think, all of our experience of science, it's something that is emotion laden in different ways. You have a beautiful dog, Jeanne.
Oh, thank you.
So I wondered, maybe this is something we could reflect on collectively, or I could invite you to reflect on. When we think about the role of emotions in science and scientific research and practice generally, not only in engagement, is there any scholarship or knowledge about this? What do we know about the role of emotions like curiosity, perhaps, in basic research? And how does that then relate to public communication? That's a very broad kind of topic, but I welcome your off the top of your head thoughts. Tania, maybe you want to kick off.
Sure. So my sense is that there actually has not been a huge amount of research about emotion in actual scientific practice. I think what we have is more evidence coming from somewhat artificial laboratory kinds of contexts that people construct in order to try to measure something over a short period of time. And then we have evidence that comes from the history of science, right, where we can actually look at scientific episodes unfolding, but we don't have the experimental control that you would get if you had a well-defined lab task. And so I think that's just a real methodological challenge that hopefully we can overcome. I mean, my sense is that, speaking from the psychology side, that historically there's been a fairly big divide between the people who study learning processes on the one hand and the people who study affect, emotion, and motivation on the other. And I think a really nice development in the last decade or so has been people on both sides appreciating that they have a lot to benefit from each other and really thinking about how to integrate those processes. Because when you're talking about a classroom or when you're talking about doing science, you need both of those working together. So I think the research is moving there. I think we're starting to get some exciting insight in those directions. But at least I haven't seen a lot of research that in the actual case of scientists practicing science. But maybe Daniel or Jeanne know of other work that I don't know about. It seems to me like a super ripe area for investigation that's just very methodologically challenging.
Yeah, Daniel, has this been something you've looked at in the course of your research at all?
Yeah, I think one of the things I want to work towards is really moving away from the kind of narrative we have in the West of the modular kind of brain image that we have, like this metaphor of reason and passion, the emotions and the like high-minded cognition, and thinking of every single aspect of knowledge as embedded in affective space. Everything has emotions. Like there's no aspect of experience, I believe, and I think a lot of the sciences with me, that doesn't exist outside affective space. Everything has a valence. Everything has a sense of arousal. And yeah, Tania really put it nicely in that first slide where she talked about when, for example, when you read biographies of scientists, they all talk about the they felt towards another scientist and the excitement they felt about their findings and their hope they felt about like finding something else, and we don't talk that much about that. It's still a lot of a taboo in the way we talk about science. It's still seen as like, oh, like we shouldn't put emotions into this objective kind of reasonable cognitively advanced discipline, but in reality, in the background, it's always affect, it's always emotions, there's always that going on. So I would like to try to think of science as always as emotion-led, and as you mentioned, Sarah. So
yeah.
If I can,
sorry, Jeanne, go for it.
I was just say, if I can add to that, as a practitioner, as someone who, has experienced basic science research my entire adult life, I want to just bring up a statistic that I recently came across, and I'm not going to quote it super accurately, but it's around this, right? It's something like 95% of Americans have only experienced science in the context of school, right? And in school, they're only learning science maybe, an hour at most per day, if that. So even a smaller portion of their schooling is this science, right? So we're really talking about a sliver of exposure. And the way that science is taught to take place in schools is for utility purposes, right? It's A goes to B, B goes to C, and C is a product that we use, and here's how we use it, and this is why it benefits humanity. It's very product oriented. And so when you think about comparing that process to how science is actually conducted in the lab or in the field or, at the computer, I don't think I know a single scientist who says, I'm going to do this for the utility, right? Everybody I know who comes up with research questions are doing so because they have an emotional connection to that research, because they wonder about it. They feel curiosity about it. This means something to them. And so there's this huge disconnect between how people are exposed to science in, the non-scientific community is exposed to science, and then how science is done. And because we exclude this idea of emotion, I think the pace of science and the process of science is really misunderstood in broad ways.
Maybe I follow up on that immediately. Jeanne, what does that mean in your practice as a communicator, as someone who is nurturing engagement? How do you find ways of conveying or allowing people access to this rich culture of scientific practice, which of course is entangled with emotion?
Yeah, and this is tricky because you often are, at least for me, I live and work in New York City, and in New York City we have such a diverse amount of backgrounds of people who are interested in participating in the process of science at RockEDU, right? So we already know that we're coming with this like amazing and beautiful picture of people that are joining us. And so what we try to emphasize in the work that we do is that it's people who do really good science. It's not good science that's done by people, right? And so we put people first. And we talk about these things in the context of ways of knowing. We put them into context of, science is messy. Science is both, at the same time, it's reliable and it's tentative. And we try to just emphasize, the nature of science in the context of humanity before we even start getting into the content, just to orient students and to set the tone that, not having the answer is actually expected. Not having knowledge or not having perfection in their knowledge is expected. And I think that, and also articulating something about science can take place in many different forms, and we have to respect, these different ways of knowing and articulation and descriptions. And I think by doing this in a more holistic way, it's been a really powerful and a way to build connection between people, which allows for a more efficient and effective uptake of the science.
I mean, this perhaps in some ways circles us back to Tania's curiosity about negative emotions, because in some ways experiencing failure, experiencing frustration, this is also central to scientific practice. And it sounds like this is something that you are also kind of helping people to see, that science is this messy, exciting, but also at times difficult and annoying and frustrating process. I wondered then, if we think about this question of negative emotions, Tania, do you ever see kind of a flip side of curiosity? Do you ever look at more negative emotions around inquiry or engagement with science?
There's two contexts in my own research where we've seen that. So one I mentioned yesterday, which is that for some people, there are some topics that feel to them to be beyond the scope of science, and we're trying to offer scientific explanation is somewhat threatening. So no, not everybody has this reaction, but some people feel like there's something inappropriate about science trying to explain romantic love or belief in God or altruistic behavior. It seems like there's a class of psychological phenomena, the sorts of things that we think make us uniquely human and special, where some people feel like science is a threat, that it's going to sort of reduce it to something. And so I think finding effective ways to challenge that perception that a scientific explanation is necessarily devoid of meaning, I think is an interesting thing to think about. The other place we've encountered it that I didn't have a chance to talk about yesterday is in the context of scientific versus religious explanations. So we have some work where we've contrasted curiosity in the domain of science to curiosity in the domain of religion. And I should say these are studies that are all with predominantly Christian participants in the United States. And I suspect we could get very different results in different communities in the United States or in different countries. But with these populations, what we find is that people tend to have higher levels of a sense that we need an explanation in science and religion. So for example, they think that a question like, why is rust red? Like that really demands an explanation. But a question like, why does God answer prayer? Or why did Jesus walk on water and things like that? People are more okay thinking that does not demand an explanation. And one reflection of that is that if you answer it by saying it's a mystery, people don't love that answer. But they hate it when it's a scientific question, right? You can just ask yourself, why is rust red? It's a mystery. Like, that's just not okay, right? That suggests we've failed in our endeavors as scientists. But why does God answer prayers? It's a mystery. People feel okay with that, right? So it seems like you get these domains where people have different attitudes towards what it is we even ought to explain. And in part, that's driven by whether or not they think we could in principle explain it. So that's one of the big predictors. People think that in principle, we can explain the scientific stuff. Maybe in principle, we can't explain the religious stuff. But we also find that people think you shouldn't explain the religious stuff. And I think that that's really interesting. And again, I do want to say that's in a particular Christian population in the United States. But it speaks to, I think it was Daniel who used the term cultures of curiosity yesterday, right? So we're finding different kinds of communities that have different kinds of attitudes towards these emotions. You definitely find that with curiosity across the domains of science and religion in the US.
Yeah, thank you. I think, again, it's emphasizing this importance of context, that these things do not always look the same across cultures. Daniel, I know that you said that this was a kind of research interest for you, so it seems a little unfair to ask you now to speculate on these negative emotions in science communication, but do you have any kind of early thoughts or ideas, or what direction would that research take?
That's a good question. So one question that I had for Tania was actually if there was a sense of how people constructed their identity around curiosity. Think this idea that I am curious, I am a person that experiences awe and wonder often, and hence, or in a way, that constructs my sense of I participate in the cultures of science communication, I go to science events, I go to science museum, I feel comfortable around science. And I'm interested in that, in how people's identities and the narratives they tell about themselves fit into their relation to science, and how what emotions are constructed around this identity. So I am a person that doesn't go to museums. I am a person who thinks science is boring. I am a person who thinks science is frustrating because it was so hard when I was in school. So my identity is I'm against science, or I don't trust science, or so thinking in terms of how these emotions and life experiences and the narratives relate to their, like, the level of relationship people have to science. I think that's a good way to move forward.
There's so much there. I'll try to say a little bit, and maybe Jeanne wants to in too. So I think in terms of our own identities, I think there's a lot of evidence, and I'm sure you know this as well, that different communities, and here I'm speaking in the United States where I know the history better, have had different really experiences of their relationship to science, right? So right now we're seeing in certain communities in the United States, for example, more vaccine hesitancy. And it's often communities where, if you look historically, they were mistreated in medical contexts and so on, right? And so I think those kinds of cultural experiences, I think, are going to play a really important role in people's trust of science, and that's going to be incredibly important. I think a more subtle point that we've seen in some of our data is that we make inferences about other people's commitment to science based on how we see them behaving in terms of curiosity and exploration. So we have some work, this is still unpublished, where people read a vignette about a person who encounters some piece of information for the first time. And their reaction to that piece of information is either to say, wow, can I have more evidence, or can you explain more? They're sort of manifesting curiosity. Or their reaction is to say, oh, I don't need any more evidence or explanation. And what we find is that for any topic, when somebody manifests curiosity in that way, they seek evidence or they seek explanations, people think, oh, that's kind of a sciencey person. That person's committed to science. But in the case of religious content, it's when somebody says, oh, I don't need more evidence, I don't need more explanations about this religious thing, that's taken as evidence of religious commitment. So we're using other people's curiosity and how that manifests in their behavior and what they say as a way to figure out what we think they value. And so I think that's the other side of the relationship that you're describing about people's own relationship to science.
Jeanne, is this something you also see in your work, this kind of combination of identity, whether that's self-identity or kind of thinking about other people, and emotions relating to science?
I mean, we've certainly, seen a clash between some of our students' identities and what we are teaching them, particularly around specific topics. Like, for example, if we were going to talk about evolution, a lot of our students often come from a faith-based background, and it's difficult for them to navigate the conversations that we might have around evolution, especially if we frame it in the context of human evolution. So first and foremost, we just try not to frame evolution in the context of human evolution. There are so many other ways to talk about evolution, bacterial, insect, that don't draw on something that feels controversial to someone. And so by eliminating the conversations around human evolution with our students, I think that really helps to open up channels for discussion. That's just one example. And we also try to sort of, instead of saying no, but we try to say yes, and. There are members of my team who are quite religious. And so by just having them showcase their yes and, like, I am a religious person and I am a scientist. And you don't have to choose. And just framing things in that way also helps. So this is specifically talking about religion, but there are other ways that I think there's a clash, generally speaking, between the framings that our students might be coming in with and what we're trying to teach them in terms of asking questions and wondering about things. It's really ultimately what we're trying to do is encourage people and teach students how to ask questions, right? And in order to ask these questions, they need to wonder. Right. And so one of the things that's been really helpful for us, and I think, Tania, you sort of alluded to something that we talk about at RockEDU, and this also draws from some of the work of Brene Brown, is, and it might not translate exactly, but we find it easy to think about, this idea of, like, you will come across something that feels surprising to you. You acknowledge that there's a gap in your knowledge. There's some sort of information gap, as Tania put it yesterday, and you can either open and feel wonder, and then move forward, or you can close and feel fear, right? And this is the part that Brene Brown sort of talks about. And so, I see this all the time, like even with my own dad, Dad, I want to change the routers in the house. So I'm going to call Verizon to do that. You can't do that. That's impossible, right? So instead of wondering how can we change the routers in our house, he shuts down, immediately say that this can't be done. And I see this a lot. And this is a tiny example, right? And I see this a lot. And so what we try to say is, wait, do you know that? Are you sure about that? How do you know that that's true? And by just sort of probing in those ways, it sort of helps them to say, wait, do I know that's true? And sometimes that helps them to open up and ask questions and feel wonder. So there's it depends on the context. It depends on the student. It depends on what their motivations are and what our goals are for whatever outreach session that we're running. And we sort of take it through there.
So I am going to stop being so selfish and now pass on some of the questions from the Q&A. I apologize, everybody, for the delay. So Don Haas has, I think, a really interesting question that relates to this topic of negative emotions and how that perhaps relates to awe. So Don asks, about the distinction between awe and astonishment. In his work in climate and energy education, he tries to astonish in ways that thoughtfully connect to provoking negative emotions. I guess this is in the context of a climate crisis and the need for action and concern. So he says he doesn't end with that, but he thinks it's important to include. I mean, maybe you can reflect on this distinction between awe and astonishment. Are these seen as different emotions, and in what ways? And how might we use emotions like awe to provoke maybe concern? I think fear is not necessarily the right word, but something at least that is a perhaps more urgent call to action.
I can say something, but okay, Daniel, go ahead, because I suspect you probably know more about this than I do. I can speculate, but go ahead, and then I'll speculate after you.
Yeah, so there's many ways of representing awe. There's many ways of representing astonishment. Some of them will be excitement and kind of related to like positive kind of excitement and meddled with joy, and some of them will be more soothing and more mellow and more kind of passive. And so it depends on how, like, what is the goal that you have with those emotions in your work. So my suggestion to that kind of thing is having clear goals in mind, clear communicative goals. You want to change people's attitudes. You want to get people to trust more science. You want to create scientific identities. Do you want people to just have a good time and be entertained, and work kind of backwards, thinking about what emotions and what kinds of what representations of those emotions would fit those particular goals. So yeah, it's kind of thinking what are the best emotions, the particular goals that I have with my communicative activity, and thinking backwards from that.
The one thing I'll add, so as far as I know, there hasn't been research on astonishment as such, although often people think about these emotions as being kind of in a dimensional space, and so they look at different dimensions that could include astonishment. But there has been a little bit more about surprise versus awe and curiosity, and I think that might be relevant here. So certain things can be surprising in the sense that we would never have predicted them, and they're very low probability. So I could pull out a coin right now and I could flip it, and we could get 6 heads in a row, and we'd all find that surprising. But it probably wouldn't really generate a lot of curiosity. It wouldn't generate a lot of awe. It's a low probability event, but we understand exactly what happened, right? And this is probably a very savvy audience. You understand that that's just as likely as any other sequence, right? So one thing that seems to characterize curiosity and awe is the sense that there is something to understand there that we don't yet understand. And so I'd be curious in terms of how Don, who posted this question, uses this when he teaches. Is part of it moving people from just being able to go, oh, that's surprising, wow, to, oh, and there's something to understand here, right? And I think that that second piece of thinking there's something to understand might be part of what might motivate people to engage in more learning, and in a case like climate change, hopefully action as well.
Thanks. Don, it turns out that I am incapable of also monitoring the chat, but I do encourage you to use that to feedback, and at least other people in the audience will be able to discuss that further. Jeanne, how have you had experiences around this? Is kind of using awe or astonishment to provoke behavior change or concern? Is this something that you include in your work at all?
I have to say, no, not particularly. So I don't think I'm well suited to answer a question of this nature, because I think, you know, I try to keep grounded in sort of the work that we're doing, which is not necessarily, you know, standing on the mountaintops, you know, looking at the beautiful horizon. It's more of, you know, I used this as an example yesterday, but like, let's just change the pH to see how this protein behaves, right? And I can't, I think it's easy to wonder about those things and to find some answers, but I'm not so sure I can convince my students that this is like awe-inspiring. Although, when people start modeling, I have experienced that teaching students how to model proteins and seeing manipulations in front of you does give them a bit of a, what, you can do this, right? And so I guess that would be my best answer for that question.
And it relates very much to Daniel's point about having a clear goal for the communication in mind. I mean, we can't do everything with all kinds of science engagement. So I think thinking strategically about what effects do we want to have, what emotions are appropriate for that makes a lot of sense. I pass on a question or an experience from Ivan, who talks about wanting to develop a museum of awe. So having kind of examples, a range of awe-eliciting scientific revelations. And he says the hypothesis is that such experiences of awe will be at least thrilling to participants and could even deliver one of the scientific community's coveted goals, more people embracing science to the point of making it their life's work. So here there's a very clear goal in mind, trying to encourage people to study science, to take it as a career path. And I just wondered, or Ivan also wonders, about your reflections on this idea as a channel of public engagement. Do we know anything about how experiences of awe might kind of draw people into scientific careers?
I don't know about the career piece specifically, but I can talk about the relationship between experiences of awe and science a little bit. So there have been at this point quite a few studies where, in a sort of short time frame, so not a whole 2-hour museum exhibit, typically more in the context of a short study, you give someone an experience of awe, and that is often something like a video of a nature footage or something like that that people report as experiencing awe in response to. Occasionally, people do look at longer experiences, like having a nature experience for a week or something like that might induce awe. Very often, what you find in those studies is that people actually report more religious beliefs after these kinds of awe experiences, which I think is maybe not so surprising, because we do associate certain kinds of awe with religious contexts, and a lot of religious ritual and religious places are designed to elicit those kinds of emotions. There's at least a couple of findings, though, that suggest you can use awe to direct people more towards science. So one study did find some evidence that for people who are not themselves religious and have a more scientific worldview, inducing awe sort of got them to think more scientifically. And then I was involved in one project where we found that people who tend to experience awe more in day-to-day life, so people who are more prone to experiencing awe, were more likely to endorse human evolution and to have a kind of more scientific worldview on a variety of measures, as opposed to a creationist one. So it does look like there are associations between awe and science, but there are also associations between awe and other kinds of frameworks, worldviews, approaches that people have. So I love the idea for the museum, and I think the challenge would be to think about, what does it mean to induce science-oriented awe, right, as opposed to other kinds of awe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Some very concrete things to think about. Daniel, I wondered what your reflections on this were, in particular, when you spoke to these science communicators, your interviewees. Was this kind of an imagination that they had in terms of provoking emotions of awe? Was it also related to ideas about recruitment?
So yeah, there's one of the varieties of awe was very clear cut. We want to inspire awe in the Science Museum because we want to get people excited about science and get the STEM workforce that of the future. So there was this clear kind of awe dedicated explicitly to get more people excited about science and get children to pursue careers in science in the future. But I want to go back a little bit and kind of think of one of the things I also want to do is move away from that stereotypical kind of mountaintop version of awe. I think it's a cliche that we inherited from Romanticism, and it has all these Eurocentric and gender connotations because it was also usually framed within the stories of white men traveling around the world and going to the mountaintops and having these kind of sublime experiences up there, and move towards conceptualizations around the idea of defamiliarization. So the idea of defamiliarization is the thing that like anything can be made wonderful, anything can be made awe-inspiring if you look at it intensely and you put enough attention and intention into observing the object closely and looking at it. And I think science is a good vehicle for making anything awesome. If you look at, I don't know, this piece of paper and you think about the process that went into it, and you look at the chemical structure, and you look at the history of this chemical structure and how and the industrial processes that made it get all the way to my desk, you can potentially, through narrative, through storytelling, through using affective and emotional words, you can convey and turn anything into awesome. So like this museum of the awe-inspiring could be potentially endless and could be this place where anything can fit. So yeah.
Thanks. Jeanne, did you want to pick up on that at all?
Sure. And I think, so I want to revise my answer to previous of using awe. Now that we can sort of delineate this idea that awe does not have to be the screaming from the rooftops, which I will admit that I cannot stand. And I hate that science is represented by this. It makes me still feel so frustrated as a scientist that this is how science is thought to be broadly, right? And I think, so I guess to revise my answer, we do use awe. And I think it's because when I select people to mentor, or I select people to give a presentation or do a workshop with any of our audiences, I select people who showcase passion for their work. And when they ask me, what should I talk about? I said, talk about what makes you tick. And when that takes place, and then I help them to make sure it's an accessible talk, and we go through these exercises and things like that. So, but if you can have an accessible presentation and have zero passion, and it's not going to land, right? And so I think by showing others that someone can be so excited about their work, I think it really comes across, and it's sort of open, and our students are way more receptive when someone is, even if they don't quite get what's taking place. Like I literally just came from a mathematics talk in biology. And yeah, even I was just like, damn, what does that slide even say? But my kids ended up having so many questions afterwards because of the passion that the speaker showcased in explaining the work that he did. And so I think, yeah, we can use awe in very effectively, but not in these sort of stereotypical ways. I think it's really about the person and how they feel about the work and how that can spread to others. And I'll also note, I don't think for me, and at RockEDU, it is not important that we're building an army of scientists. We're just way more way more interested in fostering a genuine connection with science and among our fellow society members. And so I'll just throw that out there just for context.
Thank you. I really like this distinction between the kind of top of the mountain sublime and this more kind of mundane or relatable kind of passion and excitement that, yeah, as you say, I think is much more grounded and much more attractive. This relates, I think, to a couple of questions in the Q&A, and a question that I also have and would like you to reflect on. So Gillian asks, how do you guard against awe or astonishment being seen or experienced as magic? So this kind of, maybe what David was talking about yesterday, this overload of wonder that removes all the mundane practice from science. And Jenny also asked, does inspiring awe make people feel a pseudo or real religious feeling that removes their need for scientific explanation? I mean, I think this also relates a bit to a question that I have, which is about the cultural specificities of different versions of awe, and the way in which perhaps these notions that are more top of the mountain, now that we use this language, this kind of sublime white men discovering the new world. This is perhaps one imagination of awe that sometimes science communication can try and convey, and which perhaps isn't culturally relevant to other groups or audiences, or even to most scientists. Are there difficulties or challenges to wanting science communication to provoke awe and wonder? Can it be a negative, or is it something that we should always wholeheartedly embrace? I'm not sure who wants to start. It's a bit of a convoluted question. Tania, how about you?
Sure, I'll speak to part of that. So I do think there's a tension that's already come up in our conversation today and yesterday about the extent to which the experience of not knowing something is aversive versus pleasant, and also maybe the extent to which it's motivating you towards behavior versus not. So to the extent that something like curiosity or awe or wonder involves a recognition of not fully understanding something, or there being something you don't know, you wouldn't want people to experience that as just a given. It's like, oh, I don't know, it's a mystery, I'm done. You don't want it to be aversive, but at the same time, you want it to be motivating. You want it to motivate them to explore, to ask questions, to learn more, and so on. So I think that's sort of the tricky balance. How do you make something not aversive and yet motivating? Because I do think there's a danger of presenting something as, awesome and challenging and provoking uncertainty, and now you should just deal with it and stop, right? So you can't stop there. There has to be that extra push. I don't have great evidence that I know of that tells you how to do that effectively, but I think that's the challenge to be thinking about. I don't know if Daniel or Jeanne, either from research or practice, know of good ways to make sure you direct towards the motivating version of these experiences as opposed to the complacent version of these experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's a challenge, and there's a line where people, some people even move away. They're like, oh, this is too much, it is too scary. If what's presented to them is too overwhelming and too much, there's a chance that like they might actually react negatively against that. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge when creating all-based kind of communication activities. But yeah, no. So quickly, it's very difficult. It's like this. It's really like the stories we tell around how we convey it, our language, our mannerisms, our rhetorical styles, all those things matter when it comes to creating these emotions in an audience. So yeah, just doing it multiple times and practicing and getting better at it. So it's an art rather. I think of it as an art rather than something that we need to nail down precisely with the element, because it's going to be different for different audiences. Mm-hmm. It's going to be different for different times of the day. It's not going to be the same a Friday night event at a museum or the Sunday morning activity in a park. So yeah, being very context aware, I think is the goal.
Jeanne, my core planning means that you have 20 seconds for some brief thoughts.
Oh, I think in practice, it's exactly what Daniel just said. It's really just trial and error. And I think Justin put something in the text around humility and being vulnerable is a really, showcasing that you don't always have the answers either. And it's okay to talk about that, and it's okay to have imperfection in your knowledge. And let's go from there.
That seems a great point to finish on, conveniently, because we are out of time. Thank you so much, Tania, Jeanne, and Daniel, for such a great discussion. Thank you for all the questions. I apologize for the many which I haven't managed to pass on. There is, and now I've forgotten the name, there is, I think, engagement session, a room happening next, also oriented around these questions of curiosity, wonder, and awe. I'm really sorry, perhaps someone who knows the correct name for this particular venue as part of the platform can stick that into the chat. But just to say, if you're interested in these topics, there is now a space to go and continue talking more broadly with other delegates in the conference. And we've certainly, I think, had food for thought. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you at the rest of the conference, and yeah, to reading more of this research and hearing more about the practice in different forums. Thank you, everybody, and good evening from Vienna.
Thank you.
Thank you.